In this lecture, we'll start taking a look at how to write and run Java programs. Before we look at any particular Java programs, it's worth noting that Java actually has two different types of programs. We have applications and we have applets. For this course, we're only going to be concerned with application programs. Applets were popular about 10-15 years ago, but they're not really used as much anymore, especially since there are some serious security flaws when running them. So let's take a look at an example of a Java program. Now this program is what we call the HelloWorld program. It's actually the most basic, simplest program out there. When introducing any programming language, you always start with the HelloWorld program. All this simply does is print Hello World. Now there are three key lines to this particular program, so let's take a look at them individually. So this first line, this public class Hello World, is simply the starting point of our program. Every program in Java is broken into classes. So we assign a name for this class. So as far as you're concerned right now, every Java program must have a class. And what comes after the word class is the name that we give it. So this can be whatever name we want. In this case, we called it Hello World with the two words together. It has to be one giant word. You can't have a class with multiple words separated by spaces. This second line, the public static void main string args, this is what we call our main method. Every Java program must have a main method. This is the starting point. When your program runs, it looks for this line in order to follow the instructions. So whenever you write your Java programs, you must have public static void main parentheses string square braces args end parenthesis. And then what we have inside the curly braces of this main method is the body of our program. So these are the actual lines of code that runs when we start our program. And in this case, we just have a single line. We have this system.out.println parenthesis quote open world quote parenthesis. What this method is, it just simply takes whatever's in the parentheses and it would output that sentence into our monitor. So in this case, since we have the phrase hello world in the parentheses, that's what gets printed to the monitor. Now, in order to process a Java program, there are four key steps. The first step is that we need to use some text editor to actually create the program. So we have to understand the syntax, or what we call the rules of a language. So we have to take a look at what symbols do we use, what characters mean which way. So it's a matter of just making sure we understand how the language works. And there are several different editors out there that will make it a lot easier for us. I mean, you could use Notepad if you understand Java very well, so you can just create it from scratch. But there are other programs out there that will help you, such as Dr. Java, JCreator, Eclipse. The list goes on. There are a variety of different editors that will help you with creating these files. And the files that are actually created from the editor are what we call the source code, or sometimes we call it the source program. We'll probably just use the term source code for this class. Now in Java, the name of our file always ends with the .java extension. Different programming languages will have different extensions, but for Java programs, they always end with .java. And it's also important to note that the name of the file must match the name of the class. So if we went back to our Hello World program from the last slide, the name of our class was Hello World. Therefore, the name of our file needs to be helloworld.java. The next step is we need to compile the program. We have to make sure that it's correct from a syntax perspective. I mean, if we violated the rules, then our program isn't going to run. So the compiler is a way of making sure that we did follow those rules correctly. So just as there are rules in the English language, such as your first word must start with a capital letter and must end with some punctuation mark, and there are grammar rules associated with it, or you have to place a noun here and a verb here and subject-verb agreement and everything there. We have similar rules in programs, and this is what we call the syntax. So we have to make sure that our program is following the rules of that language. And if we're not, if we're violating those rules, then the compiler will report any of these syntax errors. Now, if we wrote the program correctly and there are no errors, then the program will be translated into the appropriate bytecode, which we can then use as our executable. In Java, the bytecode is in a .class file. So if we use our Hello World program from before, we had helloworld.java, we would compile that and it would turn into a new file, which is called helloworld.class. The next step would be to load our class file into memory. Now, what's fortunate for us is that Java programs can take advantage of what we call an integrated development environment, or an IDE. So I'm probably going to use the term IDE a lot. And this contains several programs for creating and running Java programs. And there are several examples of IDEs. Dr. Java, Eclipse, NetBeans, JCreator are all examples of IDEs. And you may notice that some of these were examples of the text editors that we were talking about for creating the source code. So a lot of these IDEs will not only let you write your source code, but it will take care of compiling your code and then running the program for you. So you don't have to worry about having all these separate programs for creating and running your Java files. We can even use an IDE for developing our own libraries. Now in Java, we call libraries packages. In other languages, they're called libraries, but we call them packages in Java. So what is a library or a package? Well, it's just simply a set of related classes with all the code we need for those classes. So we'll look at some examples later on. So one such example would be a lot of the math operations that we want to do. That would be stored in a separate library, and all the classes and methods associated for performing math operations are stored there. Once the class is loaded into memory, we can use a loader for connecting the bytecodes of all the classes. This is very useful if we have multiple class files that we need to put together. So the loader kind of combines all these together into one giant program. The last step is to, well, run the program. So we use the loader for taking our bytecode and actually putting it into main memory. As we mentioned before, in order for any program to run, we have to load it into main memory first. Now, as we load each class, the loader has a bytecode verifier just to make sure that we're not violating any security restrictions and that the class itself is valid. So we can kind of think of this as another layer of just checking to make sure the program is going to work correctly, at least from a syntax and a Java perspective. I mean, you can still write code that runs, but it may not be correct, and we'll talk about that later. But this is to make sure that we're not violating any syntax or security rules with our program. So once we've run through all of that, the interpreter will execute the bytecode, and it will read each instruction one at a time and translate it into the machine language and then run that code on our machine. Now that we've gone over the steps of processing a Java program, let's just do a very simple one just to show how to write and compile and run a program. For this course, we're going to use Dr. Java as our editor, but as I said earlier, you can use any editor you want. If you want to use Notepad, Eclipse, NetBeans, JCreator, whatever you want is perfectly fine. We're just going to use Dr. Java in this course because it's a very simple editor to use. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that some of the other editors have, but it takes care of everything we need for this class. So this area right here is where we'll start typing our code right here. So let's just go ahead and do that. We'll write what's called the Hello World program. We saw examples of that already. So let's just go ahead and write and run this program. So we'll do public class, we'll call it Hello World. Some curly braces in here. We're going to do public static void main string args, and then system.out.print line hello world, period. There we go. So this is our Hello World program, and all this is going to do is just going to output Hello World. So let's go ahead and save it. We'll save it on the desktop. And then remember, the next step is that we need to compile our program, which will take our .java program and turn it into a .class file. So to do that, we would click on the compile button up here. And we need to make sure that we do have a proper compiler. So if we go under compiler output, and then we look over here, we can actually see what compiler we're using. This particular computer has several compilers. We're going to be using Java 7. In this case, it's the JDK 7.0_75. You may be using a different one. You may be using Java 8, for instance. It should be fine, but there might be some differences here and there. But for this course, we're going to use Java 7. So we'll just click on compile. Compilation completed. So everything's fine. Now this means we can run it, but let's just go and take a look at what happens if we made a compile error, just to show what would happen. So if I click on compile again, I get this yellow highlight here showing the line that caused the problem. And here's the reason behind the error, semicolon expected. We'll talk about different types of compile errors later, but this is just to show that this editor will detect any compile errors. So let's go ahead and fix it, and let's compile it. And then we'll click on run, which is right here. And now we're at the interactions tab down here. And we can see welcome to Dr. Java, working directory is C users and Willy65 desktop. And this is just where our files are going to be stored and where we're looking to run it. So this run hello world means that now that we've compiled our program, we're going to be looking in the desktop for helloworld.class, and it finds it. And then what's in the green text is what is actually printed from the program. So we said here print hello world, and sure enough, this does print hello world. So let's talk a little bit more about the interpreter. And as we've already said, the interpreter translates and executes one line of code at a time. So we just read one line of bytecode, we translate it into its respective machine code, and then we execute that code. And then we just keep repeating this until the program is done. And this is very different from other languages such as C and C++. With those languages, we would use a compiler that would translate the entire program before we actually execute. So we don't do one line at a time, we just do the whole thing. Now it's worth noting that similar to compilers for other languages, we need a different interpreter if we want to run Java on different types of machines. So if I want Java to work on Windows, for example, I need one type of interpreter. If I want Java to run on a different machine, such as a Mac, I would need a completely different interpreter for it. But it's worth noting that interpreters are a lot easier to program than compilers. Compilers take a lot of work to implement it. So it is easier to work with an interpreter instead. For our purposes in this course, we're only going to look at the first step of this process, just creating the source code.